This is a Fox News Alert. Welcome to Washington. I'm Brett Baer. Pope Francis has arrived in the U.S. The pontiff was greeted by President Obama at Joint Base Andrews in Maryland about 2 hours ago. The two will meet again tomorrow at the White House. That's where correspondent Kevin Corke is tonight. We have heard a lot about the issues where the president and the Pope see eye to eye. But there are other issues where this White House and the Vatican are on completely opposite sides.
It was a reception fit for a pope. As the leader of the free world, welcomed to the United States for the very first time, the leader of the world's 1.1 billion Catholics. The president joined by First Lady Michelle, the vice president, and his wife Jill, in welcoming the pontiff. The visit comes following the Holy Father's historic trip to Cuba, with whom he helped the United States reestablish diplomatic relations, a source of great pride for both the Vatican and the White House.
This is an opportunity for two men who have so many values in common to talk about the efforts that they are taking in their respective and quite different roles to advance those shared values.
But for all they hope to celebrate, this trip also comes against a backdrop of strong disagreements between the Vatican and the White House, particularly the Obama administration positions on abortion, same-sex marriage, stem cell research, and contraception, the latter of which was the subject of a bitter dispute over religious freedom concerning the Department of Health and Human Services contraception mandate, including some provisions for abortions. That is part of Obamacare. That's a fight now engulfing Capitol Hill as GOP lawmakers have renewed a threat to defund Planned Parenthood, which not only receives $500 million annually in government funding, it's also a major dispensary of contraceptive services.
I don't know if he'll step into that or not, but he's the ultimate protector of life in the world, and it would be, I think, important for him to make some broad statements about the sanctity of life. That's what the Catholic Church is all about.
Dozens of plaintiffs filed suit against the administration because of the contraception mandate, including Catholic University, where the Pope will celebrate Mass on Wednesday. And then there's the issue of just who will attend the welcoming ceremony. The White House, it has been rumored, has invited an openly gay Episcopal priest and transgendered activists, something that didn't sit well with the Vatican.
Well, I think they should have some issues. It's kind of rude and insensitive to try to use the Pope as a political football for what is a very extreme end of the progressive agenda.
White House officials say with 15,000 people over on the South Lawn, there's really no way to tell exactly who will be in the crowd, but we should focus on the president's message, which should mirror some of the areas of agreement with the Holy Father, including combating poverty and fighting climate change. Brett?
Kevin Corke live on the North Lawn. Kevin, thank you. You can see my entire interview with former U.S. Ambassador to the Holy See, Francis Rooney, on my blog, The Daily Brett. I spoke with him about his book, The Global Vatican, Pope Francis's Visit to the U.S., Threats to the Vatican from ISIS, and U.S.-Vatican Relations. Check that out. The fastest rising candidate in the Republican presidential pool is stepping up her criticism of her main rival. And a third political outsider is doing everything he can to stay in the race. Senior national correspondent John Roberts has the GOP wrap-up.
We will retaliate.
Carly Fiorina projected a muscular foreign policy in an appearance at Charleston Citadel today, taking on everything from alleged Chinese cyber attacks to Russia's buildup in Syria. At the same time, Fiorina has upped the retaliation in her own war on The Tonight Show, comparing Donald Trump to Vladimir Putin.
You've met Putin.
I have. Well, the two of them have a lot in common, actually. But
Fiorina is fighting back against a volley of attacks from Trump over everything from her voice to her business career. Fiorina told me she plans to stay right up in the Donald's face.
I think all of us need to stand on our record, and I'm very happy to stand on the facts of my record, and I expect that over time Donald Trump will have to stand on the facts of his record.
That record, charges Fiorina and Trump's other competitors, includes business failures, bankruptcies, and politics that run counter to conservative values, which is why Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker last night urged other Republican candidates to join him in dropping out.
So that the voters can focus on a limited number of candidates who can offer a positive, conservative alternative to the current frontrunner.
Sources familiar with Walker's decision say amid crumbling poll numbers, his campaign was unsustainable. With 90 paid staffers, he needed $1 million a month just to stay afloat. After an emergency meeting yesterday to crunch the numbers, Walker and his wife consulted with their two sons, then returned to say he was pulling the plug. On the campaign trail in Ohio today, Ben Carson said he has no intention of taking up Walker's call to drop out, and he continued to defend and explain his assertion that he would not want a Muslim as president, insisting he is a victim of political correctness.
The PC culture says whenever you're asked a question, it has to be answered in a certain way. And if you don't answer it that way, then let's attack and let's not try to actually understand what a person's saying.
Carson clarified today that he would in fact be comfortable with a Muslim as president if that person were to give him assurances that they would hold the U.S. Constitution and American values above his or her religious beliefs. Brett?
John Roberts live in Charleston. John, thank you. Republican presidential candidate and Florida Senator Marco Rubio says Governor Scott Walker will be a big part of the GOP's future. As for the present, Rubio is not afraid to point out where he thinks Pope Francis is off target. I spoke with Rubio earlier today.
As a Catholic, the Pope is the vicar of Christ, the successor of Peter, the head of the church. And in theological matters, as a Catholic, I believe that when he pronounces himself from the chair of Peter, which actually is very rare, he's infallible in those decisions. That does not extend to political issues like the economy. On moral issues, he speaks with incredible authority, and he's done so consistently on the value of life, on the sanctity of life, on the importance of marriage, and on the family. On economic issues, the Pope is a person, and the head of state, the head of the Vatican, and he has opinions about economics. I see in the Pope's comments a fundamental misunderstanding about the difference between free enterprise and corporatism. In much of Latin America, where he's deeply rooted, the word capitalism basically means corporatism, which is these large companies connected to government dominate the society and dominate the economy. In America, free enterprise is something very different. It is a place where it doesn't matter if you have buddies that work in government or not. If you have a good idea and you're willing to work hard, you can get ahead. And the evidence is stark. Look around the world. Poor people do better in open societies with free enterprise than they do in societies where government dominates the economy. And so I have a difference of opinion with him on economic models. We have the same goal of providing more prosperity and upward mobility. I just honestly believe free enterprise is a better way of doing it.
And his encyclical on climate change?
Well, the Pope what he's asking us to do is be good stewards of the earth, and I understand that. Again, it goes back to how's the best way to do that. I don't believe these big government mandates that some on the left are pushing for will achieve it. On the contrary, I think it will actually set us back and make people poorer. I think the better approach is to allow innovation and competition and market forces to drive us in that direction, and the evidence is there. America has a cleaner environment than the Chinese do, which is a closed society and supposedly one that has, is still committed to the notion of communism. And in other parts of the world where the environment is very dirty, you'll notice that governments dominate those economies as well.
With your history with Cuba, all that you've said about Cuban policy, were you disappointed he didn't meet with dissidents?
Sure. I mean, look, I haven't talked to the Pope or anybody at the Vatican about why they chose to do that. I know that the church has worked very hard to create more space within Cuban society to operate. They now have been able to open a seminary. They've now been able to open some churches. Cuba was officially an atheist government up until the early 1990s, so there's been more space for the church to operate, and maybe they decided not to endanger that. But I am disappointed because there are people in Cuba that are fighting very hard and working very hard for more liberties, more freedoms, including religious liberties, and they were basically ignored, and I'm disappointed. I'm not going to attack the Pope over it, but I'm disappointed. Now, they claim the Pope called them, said he wanted to meet with them, and it was Cuban authorities who impeded that from happening. And ultimately, I think it was an opportunity for the world to see the true nature of this regime. They're not going to change a bit when it comes to freedom.
Another big visit this week, the Chinese president to the White House. In your view, has China declared cyber war on the United States? And if you're president, what would you do?
Well, a couple points, absolutely, but this is not new. They've done a number of things. They have non-tariff barriers set up for technology companies. Xi Jinping is going to be in Seattle today or tomorrow. He's going to be meeting with the heads of technology companies. And what they basically told technology companies is if you do business in China, you have to create a back door that gives us access to your data and to your software. In essence, the price of doing business in China is to turn over your intellectual property to them. That's a huge issue long term as well because it could give them access to the information of Americans. They're no doubt conducting the most aggressive cyber operations against America of any group or country on the planet. As president, number one, we need to improve our cyber defenses by implementing the best practices, some of which are found in the private sector, are not shared with government. And that's why having a cyber bill passed is so critical. But the other is we have to improve our offensive cyber capabilities. The idea that there is a consequence and a price for conducting cyber attacks against American companies and against American government and against American individuals. Today there is no price for doing that. And so it's very easy for the Chinese to do it because they know we're not going to reciprocate. That needs to change, and that needs to be clear in our doctrine as well.
Is the Obama administration weak on China? Should they be instituting sanctions in the wake of this visit?
Well, they talked about that. They said they're going to sanction companies that have profited from American secrets. We'd like to see that happen. I think where they've been the weakest is on human rights. They talk about raising the issue, but it hasn't been prominent in bilateral discussions or in visits to China. I would love to see this president reach out to human rights activists in China. For even as the Chinese president is being feted here in Washington and greeted in official, forums, you have a Nobel Peace Prize winner sitting in jail. You have human rights lawyers that are missing, no one unaccounted for within China. If I'm president, I've said I will invite human rights activists from all over the world, including from China, to my inauguration as a clear message that America's once again on the right side of the human rights issues.
I want to talk politics on Capitol Hill. People you talk to in the base of the Republican Party are just mad. They don't understand why you can't stop the Iran deal, even though you don't have the votes to be able to do it as it's stated now. They don't get why there's all this angst about a government shutdown when you can't hold the line about something you believe in. That's what you hear out on the trail. Yeah. How do you answer those questions?
Well, first, threefold. Number one, expectations were raised unnecessarily high. This idea that we're going to win the Senate, we're going to control the agenda, just never was true. It's important to hold the Senate. We can keep a lot of bad things from happening in the Senate. But that alone is not enough. You need a president. That's why I decided to run for president. It's one of the main reasons why. We cannot change the direction of this country without the right person in the White House. So the Iran deal is a perfect example. I think we should have done a lot more early on to define its terms, to fight strongly against it, to do everything possible to derail it. But ultimately, two things need to happen. The first is people have to realize it's not a filibuster issue. It's a 67-vote veto issue. We don't have the votes to override it, so we need better senators. What about the nuclear
option on the front end?
Again, I would be open to it in something extraordinary, but at the end of the day, you're still going to need it. The result is going to be the same. The president's going to veto it, and then we need 67 votes to override it. That's why we need to elect the right president. Having Congress alone won't be enough. You need to have a president. If we have a president like Barack Obama for the next 4 years, many of the things he's put in place will become permanent, and many of the problems we have will become more difficult, if not impossible, to solve. And so this presidential election is critical. If we can hold our majorities in the House and in the Senate and elect the right person to the White House, not only can we begin to undo the damage of this administration, but we can also begin to chart a new course for the future.
So how far do you go to stand the line in what you've talked about, defunding Planned Parenthood?
Well, to me, that's not even a political issue. That's a human rights issue. People don't understand that, but to me, that's a human rights issue. They discuss it as a political issue, but to me, the sanctity of life is a human rights issue. I believe that unborn children have rights, that someone, just because they haven't been born and don't have a birth certificate or haven't yet been named, doesn't mean they don't have rights. And Planned Parenthood is an organization that's been caught repeatedly now on video trafficking in fetal tissue of aborted children. And it's an outrageous practice. Americans are outraged by it, and they don't understand why are we continuing to fund with taxpayer money an organization that does this sort of thing. And so what we've proposed is let's take the money that Planned Parenthood gets and let's give it to federally qualified health centers that don't do what Planned Parenthood does, but do provide women's health care, which is important. And what we should have said very early on is we're going to pass budgets that do that. And then the president and the Democrats will have to decide whether or not they're willing to shut down government over Planned Parenthood, because they're the ones that are threatening to shut down the government. It's not Republicans.
Right, but it's not spun that way.
Well, we didn't start early on. I mean, I thought it would be important for the leadership of our party to have outlined that early in the process, as opposed to basically waving the white flag and saying, well, we're going to take some votes, but we know we can't do anything about it. Again, it's an unacceptable outcome that we're now going to see. But I'll tell you this, if I'm president, we will deal with this issue. There's no reason why Planned Parenthood should be receiving federal taxpayer funding, especially after they've been exposed the way they have.
Governor Scott Walker, dropped out of the race yesterday. He spent his exit speech, a lot of it talking about the need for a conservative alternative to the frontrunner, pointedly at Donald Trump. Your thoughts on Walker stepping out and his message there?
Well, first, Scott Walker is still one of the best governors in America, and he will remain governor of Wisconsin through 2018, and if he chooses to run for re-election, beyond that. And he's going to continue to be a leader in our party and a leader in our country. He's just not a presidential candidate anymore, but he's still a relevant voice and an important figure in our party, and in many ways a key part of our future as a movement. As far as a conservative alternative, look, I don't view the race that way. I'm not running against anybody. I'm running for president, and that's why I've outlined a clearly detailed policy plan as early as last year. I was outlining these ideas, and I'll continue to focus on that.
So is Donald Trump qualified to be president of the United States?